Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about spears, specifically lugged spears. We're going to look at some of the pieces we've just finished up as custom orders and talk a little bit about where they come from, how they were used, a little bit of the general essence of what these spears are. Sometimes they're referred to as hewing spears as well. That is probably kind of a modern or at least 18th century conflagration of Nordic languages talking about the spears and how they were intended to be used. This comes from Njál's saga and other writings of the period, and they talk about these spears being used to pierce or hew, destroyer of mail shirts, all those kind of things. And when we look at how these spears were used, it was probably something about the intent of them. They are not for like cutting large swaths through things. They're still used as a spear. The lugs themselves allow a better defensive action in spear fencing and control of the space in the center, which is what spear fighting really is about. And they are interesting pieces. This particular one runs about 26 inches long on the head from the end of the socket to the tip. It has a fairly broad, wide set of lugs. We'll look at one in a little bit that they're a little shorter. But this is designed so that when being used in front of me, it creates a large space that has control over my opponent's spear as it comes in. I'm able to use that lug to manipulate that piece coming at me and take his haft or head and move it to the side, as it were. When you're using the spears themselves, of course, you're in this very tight space in between here. The last thing you want to do with a pole arm like this is swing it wide or in a giant arc over your head. That's just taking your weapon completely out of the fight and creating a much longer distance to travel. So hopefully you can see that these are very effective weapons. Most of it would have been used as a thrust orientated with that point. They do have sharp edges, so they could cut if it were to slash, but the type of cuts that were done were usually direct lifts or drops from a controlled space in the center where you had controlled or pushed your opponent's spear to the side and then instantly went with a thrust to the center of your opponent. These types of spears are not very heavy. This one's probably weighs less than 1.5 pounds. They are not super thick. Sometimes they'll be very thick for thrusting, but then you'll get very narrow widths to compensate for that weight. The amount of time and energy going into making these would have been considerable, so they would have been probably about the same amount of work as making a sword blade would be, really, when you look at them. They are very much a structure that is socketed onto a piece of, in our case, ash, but whatever wood they're using for their hafts, and would have been a very dynamic weapon in the hand because it gives you a tremendous amount of reach. As you get out there with those pieces, you can thrust very effectively over a long distance with them, and you can also create a very dangerous position for your opponent in a fight like that. Here we have one with some shorter lugs, a slightly different shaped spear head. It's got kind of corners on it as opposed to the leaf shape. Shorter lugs. This is probably a little more wieldy in forest areas or something like that. It's not going to catch on things if you're walking along with it as your spear would. Many of the Nordic sources talk about, your spear was always at hand or in your hand. You never went anywhere without your spear, so you would definitely want to have something that was light, maneuverable, and easy to carry all the time because you didn't want to go anyplace without it. This type of spear here is going to work about the same as that other one, where you're going to use this corner here as a guard like on a sword when you are in combat with your opponent, so that when I go to strike my opponent, I'm bringing that spearhead straight down the line, much like I would if I was striking with a long sword. You are going to control that center of the space in the fight, and then move into your next action, or continue the action through, more likely, into a thrust or a cut to your opponent. The lugs help you control that center space. They also, in the context of hunting, would not allow your spear to go too deeply, or if you're in the case of like a boar, it running up the spear shaft at you or something like that. So many hunting spears will have toggles that are loose, that are kind of on a lanyard or something, or stubs like this. But these were probably more weaponized spears in this case, in the Nordic context, that we would talk about these hewing type spears. They had many names for them: flying dragon of wounds, of the blood snake, one of my favorites, the gray rainbow of Odin. Creates an image in your mind of what the spear was used like and how they viewed them as very important weapons in their period. So if you are interested in one of these, you can drop us an email about getting a custom one made. We use different types of steel for different ones and such, but it's usually 1050 or 6150 in the heads, and then the socket and lugs are usually of a mild or carbon steel. They are great pieces, fun to play with as far as sparring. Both these are sharp, so we aren't going to do too much thrusting or cutting with them against each other. But in the case of a great weapon to have for the Nordic cultures, one of these hewing spears would be a great addition to your collection.